بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله تعالى وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد حبيب الرحمن ووسيلتنا إلى رب العالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وعلينا معهم وفيهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. فقد نوينا التعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على خير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Alhamdulillah, in our discussions on the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Quduri alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, we have just recently finished the chapter of Zakat, and we have one chapter which is kind of the bridge between the chapter of Zakat, or the book of Zakat, and the book of fasting. Right, so what we'll be talking about today is Sadaqa al-Fitr. Sadaqa al-Fitr, because it is a charity, it relates to, they put it just near the chapter of Zakat, but because it has to do with the end of Ramadan, they put it before the chapter of fasting. Right, so you can see the reason for bringing it there. One thing to mention before we go in, right, that Sadaqa al-Fitr, it's called Sadaqa, right, and he mentions here that Sadaqa al-Fitr is wajib, right? So we know that the Zakat is obligatory, is fard, right, and the Sadaqa al-Fitr is wajib. Right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sometimes in the Quran, sometimes the word zakat is used for sadaqah and sadaqah is used for zakat. Right, they're used interchangeably. Right, like for instance, the verse that we quoted for the eligible recipients of zakat, right, it starts with إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ. Verily, the sadaqah, the sadaqat, the plural of sadaqah, are for the poor. Right. However, it is understood to be, right, that sadaqah there means zakat, right? So don't let that confuse you, that zakat is obligatory and then sadaqah, all sadaqah are voluntary. Now, there are types of sadaqah which are also uh, must, right? So sadaqah al-fitr is wajib, right? For instance, there's the charity of expiation that is given, right? That is also wajib. Right? So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, right, let's start with the sadaqah al-fitr. He says, رحمه الله تعالى: صدقة الفطر واجبة على الحر المسلم إذا كان مالكا لمقدار النصاب فاضلا عن مسكنه وثيابه وأثاثه وفرسه وسلاحه وعبيده للخدمة. Right, so he says that صدقة الفطر is wajib, is necessary. Right, it's necessary. What does necessary mean? Meaning it is an obligation that is established by proofs that are either not definitive in their authenticity, or they're not definitive in their meaning, right? So had they been definitive in authenticity and meaning, they would have been fard, right? So there is, you can say that there, right, it is a lower level of obligation. So the fruits of that definition is that if a person were to say, I don't believe in Sadaqat al-Fitr, then that's not disbelief, right? Whereas if a person were to say, I don't believe that zakat is obligatory, that's considered disbelief, right? Because zakat is textually definitive in authenticity of the text, whether Quran or Hadith, and in the meaning of that text. The texts are very clear and they don't allow for other interpretations. So he mentions that who is it obligatory on, right? Who is it obligatory upon? Right, so first he says, al hurr al Muslim, the free Muslim. It is upon the free Muslim. Right, so each of these are what's called quyud al-ihtiraziyya. They are exclusionary conditions. Exclusionary conditions. That when he says that it's necessary upon the free person, he's excluding the slave. right? And by necessary upon the Muslim, he's excluding the non-Muslim. Right? And then he says, right, the free Muslim who owns a nisab, right, in excess of their necessities. Right? So again, we have a person must have the nisab, which is about close to $5,000 in gold. Right? So if a person has that much money in their possession, then and they're free and they're Muslim, and that money is not already accounted for or already used for or needed for debts or other necessities, right? That's excess money, and then it is obligatory or it is necessary upon them to pay the Sadaqa al-Fitr. So, right, with seeing that there's a slight link between the Sadaqa al-Fitr and the Zakat. Right, so there's the necessity, the precondition of the nisab is there. However, there is no condition of the lunar year passing over the money, right, as is in the Zakat. So if you just merely have the nisab amounts, right, the day of Eid al-Fitr, then you have to pay, or before the Eid al-Fitr, then you have to pay on Eid al-Fitr, whether you just recently acquired it or you've had it for a long time, right? So there's no condition of a length of time that you should have that money. So, and he says that the money that you have, it must not only reach the nisab amount, but it also should be money that is not needed for other necessary expenditure. Right, so he excludes here, he says that it's in excess of the money that they need for their house. Right, so and that's obviously the first house because that's the necessity. Third and fourth house, or second and third house, are not necessarily necessities. Their clothing, right, their furniture, their horse, which would be your conveyance, was silah, right, their weapons or their instruments or tools, you can say, and their servants who are and their slaves who are merely for service. They're not for sale. So they're indentured servants. They're not slaves that are bought and sold to make a profit. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the reason is that because all of those are essential necessities, right? Essential necessities, right? And something that is meant for a necessity is as if it doesn't exist, right? Because it's already taken, essentially. So if you have money in your account, right, but you know that 2,000 has to go for your rent or your lease, right, then it's as if you don't have that 2,000. So same thing applies here. Now, this is interesting because if a person has this same nisab, right, if a person has the nisab and they're free and they're Muslim, right, they have the nisab that's in excess of their needs, right, what happens at that point, right? Do they, right, one, they have to, it's necessary for them to pay Sadaqa al-Fitr, right? But it's also the beginning of their anniversary for Zakat. Right, so if they have the nisab, then the time they have to count that time, and the next year they would have to pay zakat on that money if they still have above the nisab. Right, and the same thing applies. These same conditions, three conditions, apply for a person to do the udhiyah, the slaughtering of the Eid al-Adha. Right, and these are the same conditions that apply for the obligation of a person to spend on their relatives. Right, so if you have the nisab amounts in excess of your needs, and you have, for instance, an elderly parent who can't work, right, and you're the only child who has that much money, then it's obligatory on you for you to take care of your parent financially. So those are some secondary issues. He moves on. He says, rahimahullah ta'ala, that who are you paying the Sadaqa al-Fitr on behalf of? Right. So the principle is that the Sadaqa is paid for every individual who is under your financial care. Sadaqa al-Fitr is paid for every individual who is under your financial care. And meaning under your financial care, meaning you're obliged to pay for them by the sacred law, not that you are paying for them out of the kindness of your heart. So whoever it is obligatory for you to spend on, you have to pay on behalf of them the Sadaqa al-Fitr. Right? So who are those people? Right? One, yourself. Right? You pay on behalf of yourself. And you also pay on behalf of your young children. Now, by young children, meaning, again, this is an exclusionary condition, meaning not your adult children, because you are not obliged to pay for your adult children unless there's undue circumstances that, like, for instance, if a child has a terminal illness or is handicapped and they can't work for themselves, then uh, that's different. But if you have an adult child who's healthy and can work for themselves, then you're technically not obliged to pay for them in the sacred law, right? So for the young children, you have to pay for them. If you have slaves that are for service, right, not for sale, but they're for service, then you have to pay for your slaves as well, right? So if you have, because again, that is another individual who you are financially in charge of spending on. Right? And now this applies whether that slave is Muslim or not, because it's not about them being Muslim, it's about them being another individual who you are taking care of financially. So Imam al-Quduri, he mentions then a few people who are not obligatory for you to pay on, you don't have to pay for. And again, these are people who don't fulfill that same principle, right? Legally. That is, he says that you don't have to pay on behalf of your spouse. You don't have to pay on behalf of your spouse. Now, if you do pay for your spouse, right? So when he's saying you don't have to pay, you're not obligated to pay for your spouse, right? Nor are you obligated to pay for your adult children, right? Even if they're under your financial care, because you're not obliged to care for them, right? Therefore, you don't have a type of guardianship over them. However, if you were to pay for them, right, out of the kindness of your heart, right, even if you don't consult them, right, the scholars, they mention that it suffices for their obligation as well, right? It counts for them as well, right? Because customarily, if you ask somebody, do you mind if I pay your Sadaqa al-Fitr? They would say yes, right? And then that would become like a type of agency, right? You would, because you had their permission, right? And partially because, right, you are, right, there's a relationship between you and them. Now, if you were to just go and pay on behalf of a complete stranger without their permission, then the scholars, they mentioned that is not permissible, right? Because they don't fulfill the conditions, nor is it customary that they would give you permission to do so to them, right? So you do not have to pay on behalf of the spouse, right? So a man doesn't have to pay on behalf of his wife, right? You don't have to pay on behalf of the children who are adult, even if you are taking care of them. You don't have to pay for your slaves that are contracted slaves, so that they're working their way toward freedom. They're paying off for their freedom, nor any slaves that are for sale, right? Even though slavery is not, right, in our context relevant, but these are the rulings that are involved. Right? And he does mention, he says that even if the slave is a non-believer, right, a non-Muslim, you still have to pay on behalf of them, right, to them. Right, so that's the first issue that he covers. Right? The second set of issues is, what is the amount that you have to give? Right? We're talking about you have to give this amount, you have to give charity, right? If you're a free Muslim and you have the nisab, that's free excess of your needs, right? And you have to pay for anyone who you are financially obligated to take care of. Okay, but how much do you have to pay, and who do you have to pay it to, right? Regarding who do you have to pay it to, right? Then that we've already discussed. The same eligible recipients for zakat can be eligible recipients for any obligatory or necessary charity, right? voluntary charity you can give to anyone and in any avenue that you wish, right? Without any exceptions or exclusions, right? But obligatory charity must be given to the right recipients, which are the ones we mentioned in the previous section, right? So, but how much must be given? He says the fitra is nisfu sa'in min bur. It is a half a sa', and a sa' was a measurement at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. One sa' is 4.4 kg. Right? One sa' is 4.4 kg of wheat. Right? So half a sa' of wheat, so that's 2.2 kg of wheat. Or if you're going to give dates, raisins, or barley, right? Or anything that is made, or sorry, dates, raisins, or barley, then you give a whole sa', which is 4.4 kg. So, right, so you can give the actual wheat, right? In other schools, that it's an obligation to actually give the wheat or the barley or the dates, or the staple food of that place. Whereas in the Hanafi school, you can give that, or you can give the monetary equivalent, because the purpose is that the poor benefit from it, especially in preparation for their Eid holiday, right? So that they have something to take care of their needs on that day, and the money just does that just as much as the food does, right? And you can very well argue that it can do it better sometimes, depending on the situation. It's very possible that the person has food, but they don't have clothing or other things. So if you give money, they can take care of their needs however they feel fit to them. Next, he mentions that when is the obligation come upon one's responsibility? At what point does one become obliged to give the Sadaqa al-Fitr? So he says the obligation of Sadaqa al-Fitr relates to the entering of the Fajr time on the day of Fitr. So Eid al-Fitr is the day after the final day of Ramadan, right? The day after the final day of Ramadan, right? So on the last day of Ramadan, you have a fasting but no Taraweeh, because at the Maghrib, right, that starts the day of Eid, the night of Eid, right? However, the obligation applies to the Fajr of the Eid, right? So for instance, if you're a free Muslim and you have the nisab, right, before Fajr comes in of the Eid day, right, then when Fajr comes in, it is obligatory for you to give that Sadaqa al-Fitr that day. However, if Fajr time comes in and you haven't become Muslim yet, right, you became Muslim later on in the day, or you were a slave and you were freed later on in the day, or you didn't have money, right, Fajr prayer, after Fajr prayer, you didn't have any money. You walked outside and some generous guy gave you $5,000. Now you're above nisab, right? You're not obliged to give that day, because you have to be, before the Fajr comes in, you have to fulfill all the conditions of the obligation to them. So he says, let's look at that again. He says, the obligation of Sadaqa al-Fitr relates to the entering of Fajr time on the day of Fitr, right? So whoever is, oh, sorry, there's a mistake on the slide. Whoever meets the conditions of obligation before Fajr time must pay Sadaqa al-Fitr. Right, so for instance, if you became Muslim at Dhuhr time on the day of Eid, you don't have to pay the Sadaqa al-Fitr for that year, even if you were free and you had the money, because you weren't Muslim at the time the obligation came down. So you didn't meet the conditions, right? Right, so if you fulfill the conditions of obligation after Fajr had already come in, right, you are absolved of any obligation. Right? However, Imam al-Quduri, he mentions here, he says that وَيُسْتَحَبُّ لِلنَّاسِ أَن يُخْرِجُوا apologies. He says وَيُسْتَحَبُّ لِلنَّاسِ أَن يُخْرِجُوا الْفِطْرَ يَوْمَ الْفِطْرِ قَبْلَ الْخُرُوجِ إِلَى الْمُصَلَّى. He says that it's recommended, right? And to do that which is recommended is more virtuous. He says it's recommended to pay the fitrah, to pay the charity, on the day of Eid, Eid al-Fitr, before going to the prayer. Before going to the prayer. Why? Because the point of the charity is that the poor can use that money so that they can essentially be free of worry on the day of Eid, because the day of Eid is a day of celebration. Okay, so if you pay it ahead of time, right, then they are free of any concern, and they can pray the salat and enjoy the day as well as others to them. But then he mentions, he says, فَإِنْ قَدَّمُوهَا قَبْلَ يَوْمِ الْفِطْرِ جَازَ, that if you pay it before the day of Fitr, right, what would be the ruling then? Right? What if you, for instance, you paid it on the 27th night of Ramadan? You gave a poor person the equivalent of 2.2 kg of wheat, or the monetary equivalent, right? Technically, the obligation has not come yet, right? You are not obliged to do it at that moment. So what if you do it early? Right? The scholars say that it's valid, right? That it's valid. It's still valid, right? Now, if something happened and the day of Eid came and you happen to not have any money anymore, you already gave your 2.2 kg of wheat a few days before, but suddenly the day of Eid you don't have the money, right? Then that counts for you it still counts for you, right, as charity, right? So it's permissible even if you pay it before Ramadan enters, right? But it's merely permissible. It's not something that it's recommended necessarily. So, right, because the cause of the obligation is that person who you are taking care of, either yourself or your young children, right? So they are there before the day of Eid, then it counts, right? Even if you are not obliged to do it until that time, right? So the time of the day of Eid is a condition. You can do things before the condition, right? But you can't do things before the cause. So if you didn't have anyone to take care of, like for instance, you didn't have children yet, right? You can't pay on their behalf, right? Because they're not there. So, and the same thing applies in zakat, that if you can pay ahead, you can pay zakat ahead. Same reason, because you have, right, if you already have the nisab, then the condition is that the 1 lunar year passes. But since you already have the money is the cause of the obligation, right? You can pay ahead even before the condition to them. Right, so he says there, right, فَإِنْ قَدَّمُوهَا قَبْلَ يَوْمِ الْفِطْرِ جَازَ. If they pay it before the day of Fitr, then it's permissible, it's valid. وَإِنْ أَخَرُوهَا عَنْ يَوْمِ الْفِطْر. But what if you pay it after the day of Fitr? You forgot, right? You go to the Eid prayer, you come home and you have some nice food with your family, and then you forgot that you didn't pay for yourself or your children. Then, right, he says, وَإِنْ أَخَّرُوهَا عَنْ يَوْمِ الْفِطْرِ لَمْ تَسْقُطْ. Right? The obligation doesn't fall off just because you missed the day. Right? Unlike the Eid prayer. So the Eid prayer, if you miss it, that's it. There's no makeup. Right? It falls off your obligation. Right? You may be sinful if if it was because of laziness, but the charity itself does not fall off, even if you missed it. So you have to make it up later on and pay for that. Right? So you have to pay for that. Right? So it will be considered a makeup. Right? Right? The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man addaha qabla as-salati fahiya sadaqatun maqbula." Whoever pays it before the prayer, which is the recommended, then it is accepted charity. وَإِنْ أَدَّاهَا بَعْدَهَا فَهِيَ صَدَقَةٌ مِنَ الصَّدَقَاتِ. And whoever gives it after the prayer, then it's a charity like other charities. Right? So it's an indication that it's, right, of less virtue. Right? So it's recommended to do before the prayer on the day, right? Permissible to do before the day, and then it must be made up if it's given after the day. So, Right, so that's all he mentions of the Sadaqa al-Fitr. And again, we mentioned that the one that you give the wealth to, the money or the food, right, it must be an eligible recipient, meaning they must have less than a nisab in their possession, or they must be, for instance, a traveler who is cut off from their money, or the other seven. There's seven total recipients. Right? They must not be rich. They must not be uh, some your children or your parents. So after that, he moves on into the chapter of fasting, right? The book of Sawm. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, as-sawm darban, wajibun wa naflun. So first he goes into the types of rulings of fasting. Uh, Prior to that, we just want to mention quite quickly that what is fasting and what is its purpose, right? So the word sama yusumu, som, right? It means imsak. It means to abstain from something, right? So this idea of som is similar to the idea of sabr, patience. Okay, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that إِنَّمَا يُوَفَّى الصَّابِرُونَ أَجْرَهُم بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ, that Allah gives the patient their reward without account. Right? So he just gives them without reckoning. Right? And we see this, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards every good deed, right? إِلَّا الصَّوْمِ, and he says in Hadith Qudsi, except for fasting, فَإِنَّهُ لِي وَأَنَا أَجْزِئُ بِهِ, right? Because the fasting is for me, and I am the one who will take care of that person, right? So we see that fasting is a very special type of worship, right? And there's a few reasons in that. One of the amazing things about fasting is that there is very little to do with the ego. It has very little to do with the self. Almost any type of worship can be corrupted by the self being involved. So, for instance, a person can pray, but their intention is to seek fame and to seek praise from people. So that's the ego working there, right? Or a person can give charity just to be called generous, right? So that's the ego there, again. So the nafs is involved. Whereas fasting, right, it doesn't really have that direct meaning to it, because fasting, you can't see it. So that's one, right? And then secondly, that because of the fasting, because of a diminishment in food and in drink and in the pleasures that the nafs and that the body enjoys, then the nafs itself, the lower self, the base desires become weakened. Right? And this is why people experience a kind of an uplifting in the month of Ramadan, because once the nafs is subdued, to the extent that the nafs is subdued, the soul becomes stronger. Right? So you can see that the soul and the nafs are kind of at combat with each other. And the stronger the soul, the weaker the nafs. Right? The stronger the nafs, the weaker the soul. So overeating in these things kills the heart, it kills the soul. Right? So whereas fasting, it makes you give preference to your soul. Right? It makes you, whether you're conscious of that or not, it gives your soul an opportunity. Right? So there's great meanings to the fasting itself. Right? And Allah says that the reason for fasting being prescribed is لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you can achieve taqwa. Right? And that's again, that once the nafs is out of the picture, then the soul can thrive, and therefore taqwa can be achieved. And then on top of that, that you have this meaning that if you can abstain from that which is normally permissible, like eating and drinking and intimate relationship with the spouse, right, for a certain portion of time every day for a month, right, out of a year, right, then why can't you abstain from that which is haram for the rest of the year? Right, so those are the kind of intrinsic meanings involved to them. So let's see what he says, rahimahullah ta'ala. He tells us that the fast is of two types. There's obligatory fast, and he kind of jumbles them together, because there's the fard fast, right, which is obligatory, which is Ramadan, right, and then there's the wajib fast. Right, wajib is a lower level; it's a necessary fast, right? So, but he combines them both into the obligatory fast as opposed to the voluntary fast, right? So you have to kind of understand words by their context as well. So he's comparing wajib, right, to voluntary, right? Not specifically wajib as opposed to fard. Tamam. So you have the obligatory, you have those fasts that are must do's, that you have to do them, and then there's those that are just merely recommended or sunnah, right? So the ones that you have to do are either obligatory or necessary, fard or wajib. Right? The fard are Ramadan, right? The current Ramadan, or any specified vow, right? So a vow is when you say that I swear by Allah that I will do such and such action. Right? So if a person says I swear by Allah that I will fast, that's a vow. Okay. If you add a specific timing to the vow, like I swear, if a person said, right, they swear by Allah that they will fast on Monday, right, or this Monday or this month, right, then that becomes a vow of specified time, right? That is considered, right, wajib, right, to fulfill. It's considered obligatory to fulfill as well. Right? And then each of these has their own different rulings, right? The second type is just mere voluntary fast, which is any other type of fast. So there are other fasts that we haven't mentioned, so we'll mention them in a moment, right? So let's look at first the obligatory fast, right? So obligatory fast would be the Ramadan, the current Ramadan, right? The fast of specified, a vow that's specified. Right? Makeup fasts are obligatory fasts for expiations, fasts for non-specified vows. They're all obligations. Right? Voluntary fasts are everything else. Right? However, Imam al-Quduri, he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, right, he tells us about a difference between within the obligatory fasts, those that are specified to a time and those that are not. Right? So either it's specified for a time or it's not. Right? So what is considered specified for a time? Right? So for instance, that if it's a specified time, like the vow that you say, I'm going to fast on Monday, or I'm going to fast on this month, for instance, right? So with regards to the different types of obligation, right, whether it's a specified time or not, then the intention changes. When do you have to intend, right? Or do you have to intend, right? So, right, you have to make an intention, right, for the fast to be valid regardless of what type of fast it is. However, only certain types of fast must you have the intention before Fajr comes in, right? Okay, so what's the ruling? Right, so if it's a specified time, right, a specified vow, for instance, I'm going to fast on Monday. Okay, so Sunday nights, right, you have to make the intention, right, before Monday of the Fajr of Monday, or else that Monday fast doesn't count, right? Because, right, so it's permitted to make the intention from the night before up until, sorry, let's read what Imam Quduri says. I think I confused something for a second. Yeah, right, so you can make the intention from the night before up until the midday of that Monday. Right, so up until midday, which is before Dhuhr. So Imam al-Quduri, let's read what he says specifically. Apologies. Yeah, this one. So he says, وَالْوَاجِبُ ضَرْبَانِ. The obligatory fasts is of two types. مِنْهُ مَا يَتَعَلَّقُ بِزَمَانٍ بِعَيْنِهِ. Some which are relate to a specific time, like the fasting of the month of Ramadan, which is a specific time, and the specified vow. It says, فَيُجُوزُ صَوْمُهُ بِنِيَّةٍ مِنَ اللَّيْلِ. It's permissible to make the intention from the night before the day, right? But then he says, فَإِن لَمْ يَنْوِ حَتَّى أَصْبَحَ أَجْزَأَتُ النِّيَّةُ مَا بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَ الزَّوَالِ. Right? If they forget to make intention the night before and they wake up, right, it is sufficient for them if they intend before the zawal, before the essentially before dhuhr time of that day, with the condition that they haven't eaten anything. Right? So you woke up, right, you missed suhoor, you didn't eat, you didn't drink anything, you didn't do anything that would break a fast, then you can still make the intention throughout the day, right? However, he mentions before zawal, zawal being just a few moments before dhuhr prayer comes in, but the correct position and the relied upon position is before the half of the day. So before half of the day is over. Right? So from from sunrise to sunset, or from dawn to sunset, if you cut that in half, you have to make the intention before the second half comes in to them. Then he says, وَالضَّرْبُ الثَّانِي, and the second type, so first type attaches to a specific time. You can make the intention from the night before up until midday. So even in Ramadan, if you forgot to intend, right, you woke up, for instance, at 8 o'clock, right, after Fajr is finished and everything, you can intend from that time, as long as you haven't eaten anything. He says, but the second time is that which is in one's responsibility without any specified timing. Right, that which is in one's responsibility without any specified time. مَا يَثْبُتُ فِي الذِّمَّةِ, right, that which is in one's responsibility, but there's no specificity of a time. Like a make-up Ramadan, fasts, or a general vow, I'm going to fast. I swear by Allah that I'm going to fast, such like that, right? Or expiation fasts, right? With regards to those types of fast, right, it is not valid unless you make the intention before the day comes in. Right? Unless you make the intention the night before the Fajr. Right? So if you're making up a Ramadan day, right, you have to know that you're fasting. You have to intend fasting the day from the night before, or at least just before Fajr comes in. And then by intention, we mean that you have to know in your heart that that's what you're doing. Right? That's what intention is. The intention is in the heart. If it helps you to bring your heart to focus by saying it, that I intend to fast tomorrow for the sake of Allah, right, then it is recommended to do that if it helps you. Right, so that applies to a missed Ramadan. So there's no specific time that you have to do it. Right? When it was current, you had to do it in Ramadan, but you missed it, either with an excuse or without an excuse. So then you have to make it up eventually. Right? So there's no specified time. For that, you have to declare that you're going to do it before the Fajr comes in. Same thing with a general vow. Right? A person says, I swear to Allah, by Allah, that I'm going to fast a day, right? A day, or any day, or a month. And then expiation fasts as well. Right? So he says, فَلَا يُجُوزُ إِلَّا بِنِيَّةٍ مِنَ اللَّيْلِ. They are not permissible, right, unless you have the intention from the night before. Tamam. Right? And the condition is that you know what you're doing with your heart. Right? Then Imam al-Quduri, right, sorry, there's one more issue that we missed. He says, وَالنَّفْلُ كُلُّهُ يَجُوزُ بِنِيَّةٍ قَبْلَ الزَّوَالِ. He says, as for voluntary fasts, meaning the fasts that are not attached to an obligation, right? Fasts that are not attached to an obligation, and so they're voluntary. He says, then they are all permissible as long as you make the intention before midday. As long as you make the intention before midday. And this is what we see in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, that that some days he would come to his family's houses and he would ask, is there any food? And if they said no, that there's no food, he would say, فَإِنِّي إِذَنْ صَائِمٌ, that then I'm going to fast. Right? So we see in the hadith that it's already past Fajr, right? But he's still intending because he didn't eat anything. He's intending. So any voluntary fast, you don't have to make the intention for the night before. You can make the intention anytime up till midday, as long as you haven't eaten or drinking or done anything that would break it. Next, he talks about the famous moon sighting issue. This issue has become a very contentious issue amongst some Muslim communities. We're not going to go into the contentious issues around it, the specifics at least, but we're going to mention what Imam al-Quduri mentions. He says, Rahimahullah Ta'ala, وينبغي للناس أن يلتمسوا الهلال في اليوم التاسع والعشرين من شعبان. Right? It is, right? He says, it is, right? The people should, right? And ينبغي is a tricky word in the Arabic. Right? The commentators they mentioned that it's an obligation, right? And it's a communal obligation for some people. He says to seek out the new moon on the 29th of Sha'ban. It is a communal obligation for people to go out and seek out the new moon on the 29th of Sha'ban. Right, and that also, so that's right. That's to establish that Ramadan has started, but the same obligation applies to establish that Ramadan has finished. So, tamam. So he says, فَإِنْ رَأَوْهُ صَامُوا. If they see the moon on the 29th night of Sha'ban, then they fast. Right, the next day they start their first fast. Right, so that night they will have Taraweeh, and the next day will be their first fast. Right, because they saw the moon. Now the problem comes that what if the view is obstructed? It's a cloudy day, right? Or you live in an area, right, that you can't really see that section where the moon would not necessarily rise from. You can't see the moon, right? So what happens, right? If you're obstructed from seeing the moon, right, then you finish Sha'ban as 30 days and you fast after that, right? So you don't consider the next, right? Right, sorry, there's a mistake on the slide. Right, if view is obstructed, then Sha'ban is considered 30 days. So you add one more day to Sha'ban, right, because the basis is that the month is going to continue. Right, you need proof to establish that the month has ended. Right, so the basis is the month continues unless you can prove otherwise. So if the sky is cloudy and you won't be able to see the moon, you have no real means of proving that the month has ended. Therefore, it ends. It has one more day, 30 days. Right, and then they will fast on the day after that, right, because that will be Ramadan. Now, there are some other issues though. Right, so that's the first that he mentions. Apologies. He mentions a few extra issues, which he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, وإذا كان ومن رأى هلال رمضان وحده صام وإن لم يقبل الإمام شهادته. تمام. So he mentions that if a person sees the moon, one individual person sees the moon. So for instance, you have a house on the mountain. Everybody else in the village lives on the valley floor, right? So you could see because you're kind of above the clouds, but nobody else could see, and they don't really believe you. So you follow what you saw. You fast, right? They don't fast, right? Unless the imam accepts your testimony, they don't have to fast. So there's a difference between seeing the moon to establish that Ramadan has begun and seeing the moon to establish that Ramadan has finished, right? Which would be the day of Eid, right? So with regards to the establishment that Ramadan has begun, right? Then it's a little bit less strict because the worst case scenario is that you fast an extra day, right? That you fast the 30th of Sha'ban and then the 1st of Ramadan. So if there's a mistake, right, then right, if a person thought they saw it and they claimed it and the leader of the community accepts their testimony and they were wrong, right, the worst thing that could happen is that they fasted an extra day. Right? But if you, right, in the establishment that Ramadan is over, if it's if it's falsely testified that it ended the day before it actually did, then nobody finished their Ramadan obligation, right? So that's a problem. So the rulings regarding that are much more strict. So right, if the sky is obstructed, so we're talking about establishing that Ramadan has started, right? We already mentioned that on the 29th night of Sha'ban, they're going to go out and look for the moon, right? If they see it, the next day is Ramadan. If they don't see it, then they consider the next day to be Sha'ban still. Now, if the sky is obstructed and there's no way to see it, right, and one individual person who is considered upright, or at least not known to be corrupt, testifies that I saw it, right, generally the Imam will accept their testimony, right? If the Imam accepts their testimony, everybody fasts accordingly, right? If the Imam doesn't accept their testimony, only that person fasts. So, and that is regardless of whether that person is a male or a female, or if they're free or if they're a slave, as long as they're not known to be corrupt, right? Either they're actually upright or you don't have proof that they're not. So, now, if the sky is clear, right? If the sky is clear, there's nothing obstructing, it's a beautiful day, beautiful clear night sky, right? Then the testimony of one person is not enough, because it's highly inconceivable that only one person saw. And when everyone, if only they would have looked, they could have seen it, then testimony of one person is not enough, right? If the sky is clear, right, and you should be able to see it, then the testimony is only accepted from a large group of people. Now, the word large is very ambiguous, right? What's meant by large doesn't mean like 1,000 people. It doesn't mean that, right? It means a group that is large enough that you would be reasonably sure that if they told you they saw the moon, that the moon is there, right? So the testimony is only accepted from a large group, sufficient enough to produce reasonable surety, right, that testimony is true, right? So, for instance, and that depends on the people, right? If it's a bunch of uneducated people who know nothing about the moon, but there's 100 of them, then that could be sufficient. You can almost be almost certain that that's true, right? Or if you have 3 of your best astronomers in your city, right, or even 2 astronomers that are, right, or let's say 3, stay away from difference of opinion. So you have 3 people who are very well versed in looking for the moon. They know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly where to look and what to look for, right? Then that might be sufficient to give absolute certainty to them. So, but if the sky is clear, one person is not enough. So, right. So he mentions that, and then even though Imam al-Quduri doesn't specifically mention it himself, in regards to the ending of Ramadan, right, the same thing applies, that a large portion of people have to see the moon if the sky is clear. Right? If the sky is clear, then a large portion has to see the moon and testify to that fact, right? So that knowledge of it is sufficient. Now, in regards to if the sky is obstructed and we're trying to establish that the day of Eid is coming, right, that Ramadan is over, right, then the scholars, they mention that it has to be right, the conditions are a bit more strict. Just one second. So the conditions are much more strict with regards to establishing that Ramadan is finished. I'll have to get back to you on the specifics of that at the moment. Seem to have overlooked that point. So, next, Imam al-Quduri, he talks about the actual obligation of the fast. What is the fasting itself? Right, as we know that certain actions have integrals, right? They have pillars, like for instance, the fasting, the prayer. You have the bowing, you have the prostration, you have the recitation, you have, right, these things that are necessary components of the thing in order for it to be valid. So, what are the necessary components of fasting? Right, and all of the necessary components of fasting are lie within the definition of fasting. Right, so, what is meant by fasting? Imam al-Quduri, he says, "As-sawmu huwa al-imsaku an al-akli wal-shurbi wal-jima'i naharan ma'a niyya." That fasting is abstaining from food, drink, and intercourse from dawn to sunset, so Fajr to Maghrib, with an intention. So you can see underlined here are the three integrals. There's an abstinence, right, from the things that would break your fast, and that abstinence is there from Fajr all the way to sunset. And there's an intention, either that intention be from the night before or up to midday, depending on the type of fast, right? As we mentioned just now, right? So then, right, Imam al-Quduri, he gives us a lot of examples of things that could go wrong, right, when you're fasting. So we tried to break this up into three principles, right? So there's things that you can do that don't break the fast. That's one, right? There are things that break the fast, and the only thing that you're required to do is to make it up another day, right? And then there are things that break the fast. You have to make them up another day, but you also have to do an expiation. And the expiation is mentioned in the Quran, which is siyam sittina, to fast shahrain mutatabi'in, 2 consecutive months, 60 days, right, in a row, and you're supposed to time it in such a way that none of the prohibited days of fasting lie within that 60 days. Right now, if a woman's menstruation does not disqualify her from being able to do the 60 straight days, the days of her menstruation are excluded and overlooked. Right, she has to do 60 days of days that she can do the fasting. Tamam. Right, so he mentions, rahimahullah ta'ala, فَإِنْ أَكَلَ الصَّائِمُ أَوْ شَرِبَ أَوْ جَامَعَ نَاسِيًا لَمْ يُفْطِرْ. If a person eats, drinks, or has intercourse forgetfully, meaning they forgot they were fasting, their fast does not break. Their fast does not break. Right, so that's the first type. Right? The fast does not break whatsoever. Right, so anything that was broken forgetfully, the fast does not break. Now there's a difference. If you forgot that you were fasting, right, the fast does not break. However, if you forgot that you couldn't do that, that's just ignorance. That's not what's considered an excuse to them. So they don't have to make up the prayer, the fasting. Right? The fasting is still valid. Right? They don't have to make anything up, as well as they don't have to make any expiation as well. The Prophet ﷺ said, إذا أكل أحدكم أو شرب ناسيا وهو صائم فليتم صومه فإنما أطعمه الله وسقاه. That the hadith of Imam, the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, the Prophet ﷺ narrate or says that if any of you eats or drinks forgetfully while they are fasting, then let them finish their fast, let them complete their fast, because Allah is the one who fed them and gave them drink. Now, if you notice, the verse, or the hadith that we just quoted, does not mention anything about intercourse. Right? The hadith mentions, right, food and drink. However, the scholars, by analogical reasoning, they have deemed that intercourse applies as well. Intercourse applies as well because they have the same underlying reasoning behind the statement. The second type is a fast that is broken by the action, and you have to make up the fast, but you don't have to do expiation. Right? So Imam al-Quduri, he gives us a few examples of that as well. Right? So he says, وَإِنْ أَنْزَلَ بِقُبْلَةٍ أَوْ لَمْسٍ فَعَلَيْهِ الْقَضَاءُ وَلَا كَفَّارَةَ عَلَيْهِ. If a person has ejaculation because of a kiss or because of touching, then they have to make up the fast, right? But there's no kafara. Right? Now, I just want to mention the principles behind this. Right? Excluding the first of the three, fasting that the fast doesn't break, right? Anything that's forgetful, the fast doesn't break. We can leave that off. Even if you eat a whole cheesesteak, right, and then you realize after you completely ate it and washed it down with some drink, right, you don't have to make up the fast. The fast is completely sound. Now, the actions that break up the fast are broken into two types. There are those that are complete offenses and those that are deficient offenses. And what we mean by offense is an action that goes against the definition of the fasting. An action that goes against the definition of the fasting. So what's the definition of fasting? Again, we said it's the abstaining from food or drink or intercourse from dawn to sunset with an intention. Okay, we excluded from that forgetfully drinking, eating, or having intercourse. So if you eat, right, so if you actually eat something or actually drink something or actually have intercourse, then that's a complete offense. That is the complete opposite of what the fasting dictates. But what if something happened that kind of similar to those things, but not completely? So the definition is, right, a deficient offense, right, is either an action that you did, but it does not fulfill the desire, right? Because why is food, drink, and intercourse prohibited during fasting? Because because they are for the fulfillment of the desires of the body, right? And that is what you're abstaining from during the days, right? Because that's where the soul is able to thrive, in the absence of those appetites, in the fulfillment of those desires. So if you do an action, but it doesn't fulfill any desire, right? So for instance, kissing without ejaculation is an action with no fulfillment of desire, right? That is a deficient offense. It doesn't break the fast, right? That's a separate issue, right? If a person, for instance, is sleeping and they have nocturnal emission or a wet dream, right? They didn't do any action, right? There may be fulfillment of desire, but there's no action, right? So there may be an action, but then there is a deficient level of desire fulfillment, right? So for instance, masturbation, right, is considered a deficient offense. The fast breaks, you have to make it up, but it's not, you don't have to you don't have to do the 60-day continuous fasting expiation, right? Because the fulfillment of the desire is not complete. It's not a full fulfillment of desire. Right, so those are considered deficient offenses. If it's a deficient offense, the fast breaks, right, because it is an offense. Again, it directly goes against what the fasting means, right, but there is no expiation due. A complete offense is it's exactly the opposite of what you're supposed to do. Right, you're not supposed to eat, you eat. You're not supposed to drink, you drink, right, intentionally or mistakenly. Right, you're not supposed to have intercourse, you have intercourse. Tamam. Right, so the examples that he gives, they all fall into these categories. So the first example he gave already is eating, drinking, or intercourse forgetfully doesn't break the fast. Right, he says that even if a person were to drink or eat forgetfully, it doesn't break the fast, but they assume that it breaks the fast. So then they actually ate intentionally. That's considered a deficient offense because they did, right, it was out of ignorance. Right, so there's some ambiguity with regards to it, and expiations are not applied unless there's absolutes, right, unless there is no ambiguity involved. Right, they're averted to the best of one's ability. Right, our goal is to not have people do 60 days fasts. Right, so to the extent that we can avert that, we're supposed to. He says, وَإِن نَامَ فَاحْتَلَمَ أَوْ نَظَرَ إِلَى إِمْرَأَةٍ فَأَنزَلَ. If a person sleeps and has a wet dream, or they look at the person of an opposite gender and they have ejaculation, right? Or they apply oil to their skin, or they do the hijama, which is the bloodletting or the cupping, or they put kuhul in their eyes, or they kiss another person, the fasting does not break. Right? None of that breaks the fast, right? Because a person who's sleeping, wet dream, right? Again, it doesn't break the fast. They didn't do it. It wasn't their choice, right? Right? Looking at someone is not an action, right? So the fulfillment of desire with no action whatsoever does not break the fast, right? Cupping and all those things don't have the meaning of the fast breaking. So he says, وَإِنْ أَنزَلَ بِقُبْلَةٍ, if a person ejaculates because of a kiss or because of touching, and touching without a barrier, such that you can feel the heat, the warmth of the body. So if it's something thin, and you can feel the warmth of the body, touching, and then there's ejaculation, because of that, then the fast breaks, and you have to do qada, but you don't have to do kafara because it's not a full fulfillment of desire, right? There's no expiation, but the fast does break. He says, وَلَا بَأْسَ بِالْقُبْلَةِ إِنْ أَمِنَ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ. It is not disliked to kiss one's spouse, right? As long as one knows, as long as one is safe from falling into something that would harm their fast, right? If they don't have that sense of security that they won't go into the next, right? They will not lead to breaking the fast, then it is disliked for them to do so, because you're essentially jeopardizing your fast. He says that anyone who vomits unintentionally, right, or they didn't make themselves vomit, they vomit, it doesn't break their fast. Whoever intentionally makes themselves vomit and it becomes a full mouth, then their fast breaks, right, and they have to make it up. But there's no kafara because there's no fulfillment of desire. So, he says that whoever has intercourse intentionally in either of the front or the rear private part, even though the rear private part is haram, right, but the same ruling applies, right? Or they eat or they drink intentionally, right? Then they have to make qada and kafara. They have to make qada and expiation, because that's a complete offense. They have to make up that day, and they have to do the expiation, which is 60 days of fasting, right, in a row. Right, now, breaking the fast in any other time besides Ramadan there's no expiation whatsoever. So if you start a voluntary fast and you break it, it's necessary for you to make that day up, but there's no expiation, regardless of how you broke it. After that, Imam Quduri, he mentions things that do not break your fast. Now, why would that be a chapter to add? Right? Because these are things that people may assume for some reason, either textually or just because of an assumption, that they would break the fast, but they don't. To them, right? So these are important issues, even though even a basic understanding of this chapter would make you understand why these things don't break the fast. But some people may think so. Right, so there's some confusion with regards to it for the uneducated, right? So, for instance, right, fasting is only broken, right, by anything that reaches the internal body cavity, right? So that's the meaning of food and drink, right? Food and drink is just an expression that entails anything that reaches the internal body cavity. Right? So if you put something from out that is not in your body into your body from outside, right, and it goes to the inward body cavity, then the fast breaks. right? If nothing ever reaches the body cavity, then the fast doesn't break at all, right? So that's the necessary conclusion to that, right? So what is something that would reach the inner body cavity besides the obvious, right? Besides your cheesesteak or your bottle of soda, right? So for instance, an enema, like if there's liquid injected through the anus, or an IV injection, an inhaler, first-hand cigarette smoke, so you're actually smoking it yourself or drawing it in intentionally, right? All of that has the same meaning of something that is going into the internal body cavity, even though those things are not considered food or drink, right? Because they entail the same meaning. The body benefits from it in some way. Regarding the cigarette smoke, the desire to smoke is fulfilled. So that's a type of benefit, even though there's harms. Right? IV injection, the medicine goes to the body. Right? It benefits. Inhalers the same way. Right? So food, right, is that desire and benefits of the body. So anything that has desire or benefit to the body and it reaches the internal cavity, right? So the stomach or the throat or the like, then it breaks the fast. So the IV injection does not go through your mouth, right? It goes through your veins, but the same idea applies. Right? The second, right, is, right, if nothing reaches the internal cavity, the fast doesn't break at all. Right? So no one's fast can break, right, by anything that does not reach the internal cavity except for intercourse. Right? Tamam. So what are examples of that? Right, eye drops. If you put eye drops in your eyes, the liquid from those drops does not reach the inside of your body cavity. If you put kuhul on your eyes, or you put lip balm on your lips, for instance, or you taste something with your tongue, right? Just tasting something with your tongue does not necessarily mean that that thing went into your body, right? Because a taste is a quality, right? It's not the thing itself. If you actually put a morsel of food and that was swallowed, then that's a different story, right? However, it's disliked to taste something without need, which we'll mention in a second. On top of that, other things that people may assume to be things that break your fast, like for instance, lying or backbiting, right? And the reason is that there are hadith that the outward purport of the hadith makes it seem that lying breaks your fast or that backbiting breaks your fast. But rather what is meant is that lying and backbiting, they nullify the reward of the fast, not the validity of the fast. Right? And there's hadith that رب صائم ليس له في صيامه إلا الجوع والعطش. There's many people who fast and they get nothing from their fast except for hunger and thirst. Right? And there are hadith where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in hadith Qudsi that whoever doesn't leave false testimony and lying, then I have no need for their fasting. Right? So these hadith are with regards to the reward of the fast, not the breaking of the fast. Right? So if somebody lies and they assume that the fast breaks, right, and then they were to eat, because of that confusion, they don't have to make the expiation. Right? They only have to make up the day. Same thing, there's a hadith that the al-hajim wal-muhtajim, right, that the one who does the hijama, who does the cupping on someone else, and the one who gets the cupping done, both their fasts break. The scholars mentioned the reasoning for that statement is that in the past, when they would do the cupping, they wouldn't use suction cups. They would actually use their mouth to create the suction. They would have like a horn type thing with a hole on the top, and they would use their mouth to create the suction. So it's possible that something would go in your mouth. So it's essentially the Prophet telling you, be cautious of doing the hijama on someone else when you're fasting, because you could break your fast. And in regards to the one getting the fasting done, they become so weak that their body can't handle the fasting anymore, and they have to drink or eat something that again breaks the fast. Now the third thing is, right, things that are unpreventable are considered excused. Right? So if something does go down your throat, for instance, or you inhale something, but you weren't able to prevent it. So for instance, you're in a dusty country and a gust of wind comes and blows dust in your face, and you get some in your mouth, right? Or you're walking past somebody who's smoking and they blow the smoke out just as you're walking past, and you breathe in some, right? You are excused, right? Those are excused because there's no way for you to prevent that. Same thing applies to steam. So if you're cooking and it just happens, some steam happens to waft into your face, if it's a little bit, it's excused, especially if it's unintentional. But if you intentionally open the pot and smell and breathe in the vapors, then that's intentional, and that's something that you could have prevented. Right? That would break the fast. Right? Again, with no expiation. The last thing that Imam al-Quduri tells us is about the people who do not have to fast. They're not obligated to fast. They're excused from fasting, I should say, right? Because the obligation of fasting is on those who fulfill the conditions of obligation, right? So who fulfills the conditions of obligation, right? They are those who are considered mukallaf, right? Al-mukallaf is the person who is Muslim. They are mature, so they are adults. They've reached puberty, right? And they are sane, that they have their sanity intact, right? They are obliged to pay, to fast. Now, if a person, right, a non-Muslim doesn't have to fast, right? And so those are exclusionary conditions as well. Now, who else has to fast? Right? Who else is free from having to fast? Right? Meaning they're excused from fasting, even though normally they would have to fast. He says the sick person. Right? So he says, "Man kana maridan fi Ramadan." Whoever is sick during Ramadan, فَخَافَ إِنْ صَامَ إِزْدَادَ مَرَضُهُ, and if they fear that if they were to fast, their sickness would get worse, right? Then they can choose to not fast that day, and they would fast a later day. They would delay the fast to another time. I believe there's some questions before we move on to this section, this last slide. Can Sadaqa al-Fitr be paid days before Eid? Yes, the Fitr can be paid before the Eid. It can even be paid all the way up to even before Ramadan, as long as the person that you're paying for exists at that time. Right? So if you're paying for yourself, obviously you exist, or else you wouldn't be paying. If you have children that are present at that moment, then you can pay on their behalf. If you don't have the child yet, you're expecting him after Ramadan, then you won't pay on their behalf. Got Fajr time and inshallah. Okay, Tom. How about accidental? That's a great question. Right, so we mentioned that intentionally eating, drinking, or intercourse. Let's take this off. Intentional eating, drinking, or intercourse it breaks the fast. It must be made up, and the expiation is due. Forgetful is excused completely. The fast is still valid, right? But what about accidental? Right. So accidental, right, is not excused, right? So the fasting does break. However, because it was accidental, right, there's no expiation due because it's not a complete offense. Right, so what's an example of accidentally breaking your fast? For instance, you're making wudu and you're rinsing your mouth, but you accidentally swallowed the water. Right? That breaks your fast. But you don't have to make the expiation. You only have to make up that day. Right? Does the expiation of 60 days for every fasting necessary? Good question. Okay, so if a person does a complete offense, they have to make up the day, that specific day that they broke, and they have to do an expiation for 60 days in a row of fasting. Now, if a person does multiple things in one Ramadan, so for instance, right, the first of Ramadan, they ate something intentionally, broke their fast, 60 days of expiation due. Right? On the 5th day, they did the same thing. Right? And the 10th day, they did the same thing. Now, do they have to fast 60 days for each day that they broke intentionally? No. Right? So the scholars, they mentioned that if you have multiple penalties, each requiring an expiation, right? As long as you haven't done an expiation for any of the previous ones, then they're all combined under one. You can do one expiation to fulfill all of them. This is similar to the prostration of forgetfulness in the prayer. If you did multiple things wrong in the prayer, right? All necessitating a prostration of forgetfulness. One prostration is sufficient. However, if you, for instance, Ramadan of 2019, you broke your fast intentionally on one day, right? And then immediately after Ramadan, you did 60 days of expiation. So that's gone. The next Ramadan comes, you did another thing, you have to do a new 60 days. Right? So if you haven't done any expiation for all of the penalties before, then one expiation suffices the past. But if you did, then new expiation is due for each next one. I am searching the truth. May Allah give you the truth. May Allah manifest the reality of His name, the true, upon you and us, inshallah ta'ala. So back to the one who is excused. The one who is sick and the fasting will increase their sickness, then they are allowed to delay the fast to another day, to any day in the future that is possible for them to fast. Right? So if they have a temporary sickness, for instance, and they're not able to fast a day or some days of the month, then they wait until they're healthy enough to fast and they make it up. No penalty on them. He says, وَإِنْ كَانَ مُسَافِرًا لَا يَسْتَضِرُّهُ بِالصَّوْمِ فَيَصُومُهُ أَفْضَلُ وَإِنْ أَفْطَرَ قَضَاءَ وَقَضَاء جَازَ. That if a person is traveling, right? So I put fasting person, should be traveling person. Right? If a traveling person is not harmed by fasting, right, then it's better for them to fast. If you're traveling and you're in the comforts, if you're in a comfortable hotel and you're staying there for a few days and you're not, right, and it would not be difficult for you to fast, then it's better to fast. However, right, the permission for the traveler to not fast is an unconditioned permission. You have full right to not fast, even though it is more virtuous to do so. So if you choose not to fast, it's permissible, but you do have to make up that day at another time. Right? Allah says, "Man kana maridan aw ala safarin fa iddatu min ayyamin ukhar." Whoever is sick or on a journey, then they make up the fast on other days, from other days. So he says, وَإِنْ مَاتَ الْمَرِيضُ أَوِ الْمُسَافِرُ وَهُمَا عَلَى حَالِهِمَا لَمْ يَلْزَمْهُمَا الْقَضَاء. If a person doesn't fast because they're sick, or they don't fast because they're traveling, and they die in the state of their sickness, or they die while traveling, they don't have to make qada. They don't have to make up those days. Obviously, the deceased person doesn't actually make up the days, but they would, an expiation would normally be paid on behalf of missed fasts of the deceased. But for for the person who died in their sickness or in the journey, they don't have to pay even the expiation. It's not obligatory on them. Because we just mentioned the verse that whoever is sick or on a journey, then they fast other days. So if they never reached the opportunity of other days to make up those fasts, right, then they are not obliged to do it. Right. So, for instance, if a person was sick the whole Ramadan, right, they had type 2 diabetes, right? They couldn't fast. They have to eat something every other few hours, right? They couldn't fast, so they don't fast the whole Ramadan. They're sick. Right? After Ramadan, they're healthy for about a week, right? And then after that week, they pass away. Right? What is due on them? Right? They are only obliged, right, for 1 week worth of fasting. 1 week worth of fasting, because out of all of the 30 days of fast that they missed, they only reached a time where they were healthy enough to fast for 7 days. So those 7 days are the other days that are mentioned in the verse, and that's so their children or whoever it is will pay expiation for those days on their behalf. Same thing with the traveler. If a person is traveling and they die during the journey, they don't have to make up the days that they didn't fast during the travel. But if they came home and a week later they died, they'd have to make up that week, right? Because they had 7 days of opportunity to make up fasts from that Ramadan to them. And then he says, if the sick person becomes healthy or the traveler returns home, right, then they make up the fasts according to the amount of time that they're home. So if they missed 30 days and they were home for 30 days, then they could have made up all of those days. And then lastly, we'll finish here. He says makeup fasts can be made either together in a row. So if you missed, for instance, 1 week of fasting in Ramadan because of menstruation, for instance, which is common, then after the Eid, where you can't fast on the Eid day, but after Eid, you you have 7 days to make up. You can either do 7 in a row right away, right? Or you can do 1 a week for the next 7 weeks, or 1 a month for the next 7 months, right? So there's no obligation specified how you have to do it. You can do it together or broken up. However, you should aim to make up all your expiation, all your missed fasts before the next Ramadan comes in. But even if the next Ramadan comes in, right, then what you do is you give preference to the Ramadan, the current Ramadan, not the makeups, right? And there's no extra expiation due on those days that you missed, right? But you still have to do them eventually. So after that Ramadan, you will continue making up from them. The reason why it's better for you to make up the fast right away, obviously, because anyone can die at any time. But in the Shafi'i school, that if a person has missed fasts and they don't make it up prior to the entering of the next Ramadan, then they have to still make it up, and they have to give expiation. So I have a question here. For example, if a child can expiate for their deceased parent in cash, or are you cash kind, or feeding poor? So the expiation for the missed fasts is similar to the Sadaqa al-Fitr, and it's for each day you would give a half saw of bur, so 2.2 kg of wheat, or the equivalent in money, to a poor person, right, for each day of fasting. So if they missed a whole month, right, you would take 2.2 kg of wheat, the monetary value of that, times 30, and you would give that to a poor person, right, who's Muslim, right? A Muslim poor person, so meaning they have to be eligible to receive. So we'll stop there, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Next week, inshallah, we will finish the chapter of fasting, which includes the chapter of i'tikaf, the secluding oneself in Ramadan, in the masjid. So we'll finish that, inshallah, in the upcoming classes. وصلى تعالى على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وسلم الحمد لله رب العالمين. If there's any questions, we have a little bit of time to take 1 or 2 questions, if there are any. How much would it be for 1 day of fasting? Expiation for 1 day of fasting would be, it would be whatever the monetary equivalent of 2.2 kg of wheat is. That's how much it would be for 1 day. Now, with regards to the wheat or the dates or the raisins, whatever it is that you're going to use, you don't have to get the most expensive brand nor the most cheap. So something moderate. How you can even just go to the supermarket. Okay, see, okay, there's a bag of wheat. This is the middle brand. It's not the most expensive, not the most cheap. Okay, and they're selling it for, say, $1 per kg or $2 per kg, right? You know that you need 2.2 kg, so that's about $4.40, right, for every day of Ramadan. So you would give, right? So say you have 10 days, so that's $40, right? Or how is that? Yeah, so however many days you would do it, and you would give all that to a poor person. Any other questions? Can one give it to people in a different country? We covered this issue in regards to zakat. So the basis is that you would give your charity to, first and foremost, those of your family who fulfill the criteria. So your cousins or siblings, or Right? You can't give children, you can't give your parents, but there are certain people in your family, so they have precedent, they have preference because it entails both charity and family ties. Uh, if there's no family members, then the people in your community, obviously giving preference to those people whose acquiring of that money would do more service to the religion, right? So scholars, righteous people, elders, these things. Uh, However, if there is people in other countries who are more needy, right, then it's permissible to give to them. If you have a choice between a person who's needy in your community or a relative in another place, then you can give preference to the relative, right? So it's permissible, right? Either way, it's valid, but it's recommended not to transfer the money from out of the community, right? Unless there's extra virtue in doing so, such as it being people who are more needy than the people of your community, or people who are friends, who are family members, or scholars, or people who would benefit the deen to them. Is it still valid to give the expiation to someone in other countries if done so just because it's more affordable? It's still valid. Either way, it's still valid. Right? As long as the person you gave it to is a Muslim and they are uh, considered legally poor, then it's valid. Any other questions? No? بارك الله فيكم وصلى الله تعالى على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم الحمد لله رب العالمين وإياكم